Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us virtually, in person. Great to have even a hybrid meeting. It's great to host these meetings with more than just my pajamas on. I'd like to thank everyone for their interest in human rights in Latin America. We're going to talk today about the democracy conditions in Latin America and what the policy responses are and can and should be. Now, of course, Latin America is a diverse region. There are more than 34 countries, more than 650 million people. And there's great variation even in terms of the democratic varieties that we see within the hemisphere, stretching from the collapsed state of Venezuela, the autocracies of Nicaragua and Cuba, to the more advanced and still democratizing situations in Uruguay and Costa Rica, which have shown a remarkable resilience in the face of both the COVID pandemic as well as economic decline. And in fact, there's been a lot of positive in the last couple of years as well. We ended 2019 a wave of social protests, but we see now a wave of elections that have occurred last year and this year that have helped let off some steam, if you will, in some of these countries and help usher in new governments. In some cases, in the case of Chile, for example, a new generation into power, which is very important. Sort of recasting and updating these democracies, some of them are 30, even longer years old. So what we have here is two experts. On my left is Tamara Tarasuk-Bronner. She's the acting director of America's Watch at Human Rights Watch, based in now Uruguay. She has an LLM from Colombia, and she's worked in Human Rights Watch for 16 years, she told me today. James Doris is the head of Latin America and the deputy director of the Americas at the FCDO. Before that, he was high representative to Sri Lanka and was ambassador to one of my favorite countries in the region, Peru. So I'm looking forward to your responses. The thinking here is we'll have Tamara talk a little bit about her analysis from Human Rights Watch's perspective on, if you will, sort of the human rights concerns in 2022. And then James will talk a little bit about the UK response and what it's keeping an eye on. And then I'm going to turn to Tamara to just answer some of those in terms of her perspective as an activist on this area. And then we'll open up the questions to you. What I ask you to do is please put your questions in the chat box and I will, or questions, clicking the Q&A or the chat, and I will call on you and you can introduce yourself and ask your question directly at that point. I will also add this is being recorded, so this is not under the Chatham House rule. This is a public event, so remind you all that it will be up on the Chatham House website. So, Tamara, please take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks Chatham House for the invitation. I'd like to just explain briefly where I think we are in terms of human rights and democracy in Latin America. And my first comment is that we are probably in one of the worst moments in a long time in Latin America. We find ourselves defending democratic spaces that it took us a lot of time to get and achieve in the region. And that now, after some time taking them for granted, we are now fighting back spaces that we are starting to lose. These alarming setbacks are clear, and I'll give more examples in the extreme cases of Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua. But it's also clear in other countries in the region where democratically elected leaders arrive to power after an election, but exercise power abusively. When we talk first about the dictatorships in Latin America, this is pretty clear cut. So let's take Cuba, for example. In July last year, there were massive anti-government protests in Cuba for the first time in a long, long time. They were met with brutal repression by the Cuban government. This includes not only political opposition, but even artists who were arrested. They were subject to mistreatment. They were beaten, interrogated. They were forced to squat naked in detention. So the level of abuse was pretty brutal. And they were subjected to criminal prosecutions without any due process. So, for example, The regime has recognized that 710 people were subject to prosecution, are being subject to prosecution. Of those, 172 have already been convicted, initially in trials that were conducted in what they call summary trials with sanctions of up to 1 year in prison. But today, they're being subjected to criminal prosecution without due process for the crime of sedition, which includes undermining the socialist order. And that can lead to a sentence of up to 25 years in prison. In the case of Nicaragua, where there's an absolute concentration of power under the government of Daniel Ortega, the government conducted a raid of detentions in the months leading up to the November elections. Between May and November, they detained more than 40 people, including 7 presidential candidates. These people were interrogated, they were held incommunicado. They were also subject to prosecutions and trials without due process. On February 1st, they started conducting these trials. These are closed-door trials held in hours or days, and the people are being tried inside the prison of El Chipote, not in courtrooms. This includes even a collective trial that is taking place against 7 of these 40-plus detainees. These are the latest cases in a wave of arbitrary arrests. More than 130 people have been detained since the crackdown of 2018. In the case of Venezuela, we unfortunately continue to see the same levels of repression. What we saw last year was a formal recognition of how bad the situation is, with a decision by the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court to open an investigation into allegations of crimes against humanity. Another report by independent experts of the United Nations that concluded that the Venezuelan judiciary had been complicit in the abuses. And there has been another report by European Union electoral monitors who for the first time visited Venezuela in 15 years to show and conclude that conditions for the elections in November were, to say the least, not free and fair. But as I said, it's not just these democratically elected leaders that are of tremendous concern, but also cases like the government of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, who are leaders who get to power after elections, but once in power, have conducted a series of measures to first undermine judicial independence, which is a fundamental check on executive power, to go after the independent press, and to make it harder for civil society to conduct their work. And we see a constant pattern in these cases of leaders of all ideologies following the same authoritarian playbook that is of tremendous concern. And we can talk more in detail about how that has played out in those 3 countries. I would just add that in other countries in the region, we are also seeing how judicial independence is a problem, and authorities use the judiciary politically against political opponents. And that has been clear in other Central American countries like Guatemala or Honduras, and certainly in the case of Bolivia, where since Evo Morales, all 3 governments in power have used the judiciary against their political opponents. Meanwhile, we are seeing in the region 2 very serious concerns. One is the consequences of the pandemic. The pandemic has been a wonderful excuse for authoritarian leaders to commit abuses, limitations of rights that they probably would have wanted to implement anyway, but they're doing so using the pandemic as a pretext to limit free speech, to limit the right to to mobilize. And in addition to that, the pandemic has made inequality, which already was a problem in Latin America, even more profound, undermining economic and social rights. A clear example of that is the right to education. There are millions of kids in Latin America who had a very hard time having access to education during the pandemic due to pandemic-related restrictions. And those who suffered the most are children in low-income communities, children who live in rural areas, children who don't have access to the internet. And the third big area of concern in terms of human rights in Latin America is migration and the refugee crisis. First of all, the Venezuelan refugee crisis remains of enormous concern. There are more than 6 million Venezuelans who have fled the country since the crisis spiraled. That's 20% of Venezuela's population. It is estimated that the number will reach nearly 9 million by the end of this year. This generates enormous problems for the Venezuelans who are fleeing, and also for host countries who, in the middle of the economic consequences of the pandemic, also have to deal with this wave of immigration. And what we've seen is difficulty to access legal status. Without legal status, it's harder for people to send their kids to school, to have access to health care, to be able to report a crime they were victims of without fearing being deported. And in addition to the situation of Venezuelans, we are seeing a growing number of Nicaraguans fleeing the country. More than 110,000 have fled Nicaragua since 2018. And thousands of people who are leaving Central America, crossing Central America through Mexico to reach the US border, where they are being victims of violence and abuse by Mexican immigration authorities and security forces. And just finally, I would make a few comments in terms of the electoral context in Latin America. This is a moment where there are a lot of elections going on or have recently happened. I think it's an oversimplification to talk about waves towards the left or waves, ideological readings of these elections. Given this context, it is extremely important to analyze how the elections are conducted and also what do leaders do once they are in power and they get to power. So last year, we saw the electoral shams in Nicaragua and Venezuela, which were not free nor fair. We saw the election in Peru, where Keiko Fujimori challenged the electoral results, putting at a test democratic institutions in Peru. We saw the elections in Honduras. It was a very polarized election. There was violence in the political campaigning. Nonetheless, they were fairly peaceful elections with massive turnout. Now the big challenge is how the government of Xiomara Castro is going to be able to govern in the country that she has inherited. And we saw the elections in Chile, where there was a very polarized campaign and election, but the way the transition of power is happening in Chile is an example of democratic civility in Latin America. And that is something that is worth highlighting as well. And this year coming up, we are currently finalizing the elections in Costa Rica. There will be presidential elections in Brazil and in Colombia. And I think it's important to monitor what happens, particularly in Brazil, where President Bolsonaro has already made unfounded allegations of electoral fraud. And it's important to see, what happens and to support Brazilian institutions that have continued to act as a check on executive power over the course of the last few years. And in Colombia, I would just highlight that we are seeing increasing levels of violence in areas controlled by illegal armed groups. Some of those levels are reaching numbers that are as high or higher than those before the peace accords. So it's really important to see how that is going to play out in the way people can effectively exercise the right to vote, and how can campaigns be carried out, and how are the elections going to actually happen in Colombia. And just to finalize, and I look forward to hearing from James in terms of what the UK and the European Union can do, but I would just like to highlight a few thoughts. First, there's enormous competition in the world. There are a lot of problems going on, but what I think an important point is for the UK and the European Union to pay attention to Latin America. Because as other crises unfold in other parts of the world, Latin America continues to be in a very, very complicated situation that requires international attention. How to do that is difficult to answer, but I would urge authorities to be strategic and to find concrete steps that can be taken and fight those battles that can be fought and that where there can make a difference. And, just a few examples, for example, from Europe and the UK, there has been pressure to the Brazilian government to try to improve its practices related to climate change and deforestation. And it has had an impact, although the situation is still very complicated and forest defenders continue to be threatened in Brazil. There is a response by the Brazilian government, largely due to international pressure. Can we move that pressure to include issues related to democracy and human rights and other challenges that Brazil is facing? The situation in Cuba, for example, is a complicated one for Latin America because there's this ideological divide. And several governments in Latin America tend to avoid questioning human rights abuses in Cuba because they question the US embargo. And it is possible, and the UK has had a principled approach criticizing the embargo and criticizing the human rights violations in Cuba. That is a role that should be modeled, and it could be a leader doing that, providing a space for others to support the view of you can criticize both the embargo and the human rights violations in Cuba. And a final point that I think is important, and which is maybe the silver lining of this very dire situation in Latin America, is that despite this terrible context, we have seen and we are seeing in Latin America strong responses by independent journalists, by human rights defenders, by judges, by prosecutors, who continue to expose and try to put a check on these executive power abuses. So one of the key recommendations, I think, for the UK and the European Union is to continue supporting these efforts, because in some parts of Latin America, that is all that is left to try to protect and regain these democratic spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. James, matters of sort of the elected autocrats behaving as dictators, if you will, sort of the dictator's playbook, matters of political polarization, challenges to electoral integrity. We see in Brazil, of course, a new wave of elections in Brazil, Colombia in the second round, in Costa Rica. Another one I would just add, in the case of the United States, policy in Latin America is on autopilot in some cases. If you can even argue that it is a policy. It's often sort of now, in the case of Central America, locked in on immigration, but oftentimes violating its own sort of commitments on migrants and asylum seekers. Your thoughts on the UK's position? Thank you.
Just quickly, Chris, I'm noting it's rather dark on screen. Do you want to talk to a particular camera or just to the front?
Just talk to the front. I would just like to add, well, you mentioned we have 125 people on the virtually, so thank you. It's looking a little thin here, but I do want to let you know, this is the problem with hybrid events often, is that we feel like we're just talking among a group of friends, but there's a large audience in front of us. Go ahead, James.
Can I start by saying, Chris, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join you this afternoon and tomorrow. It's a pleasure to be with you, sharing the floor. I'd like to use my introductory remarks to make 6 points. First, that we need to be careful with generalizations. As Chris said in his introduction, and as everybody on this call will know, Latin America is a huge region of equally enormous variety, political as much as economic and social. In recent years, there's been some good news for democracy in the region, and there's been bad news. There's nothing new in this, of course, though democratic traditions go back 2 centuries in a good number of Latin countries. Every country in Latin America has experience of military dictatorship and authoritarian government. Second, yes, there has been a serious decline in democracy in some regions in the country. In some others, it's perhaps been more of a backsliding than decline, with democratic processes and institutions under the sorts of pressures that Tamara was describing. Nicaragua is one country that stands out, with Daniel Ortega's, quote, re-election, quote, last year, a farcical process that involved arresting opposition candidates, harassing opposition parties, muzzling the press. It was a self-serving betrayal of the Sandinista movement. In others, people in positions of power have authorized and encouraged attacks on democratic institutions. Take the ongoing series of court actions in Guatemala against officials and lawyers who've led the fight against corruption. And in other countries in the region, attacks on democratic processes and structures have continued in spite of the authorities' best efforts, not because of them, Take the drugs-fueled conflicts, attacks by serious organized crime groups in Colombia and Mexico, for example. Third, that in recent years, confidence in democracy has been in decline as much as or more than the decline in democracy itself. That's the confidence in democracy. Democracy in Latin America was already facing serious challenges before the COVID pandemic hit in 2020. Pre-pandemic polling by Latinobarometro showed support for democracy at its lowest level in 20 years and dissatisfaction with the way democracy works at its highest levels since surveys began in the mid-1990s. Trust in parliaments and political parties were also at near record lows, with 4 in 5 of those polled saying that they thought their countries were governed for the benefit of powerful elites. Public discontent with poor quality public services, particularly health and education, endemic corruption, high rates of insecurity, and in some countries, deep distrust of a traditional political class provoked a wave of social protests across the region two years ago in 2019. Fourth, that the news coming out of Latin America is not all bad, as Tamara also said. For example, there have been 6 pretty free and fair presidential elections in Latin America during the pandemic. Not everyone is happy with the results, but all 6 have led, or in Chile's case, is leading to peaceful transfers of power between different political forces. I agree with Tamara's assessment that autocrats in the region have used COVID as an opportunity to further restrict liberties. At the same time, in many countries in the region, democratic institutions and processes have proven resilient despite the ravages of COVID. And in many, democracy, in its broad sense, is thriving. And where it isn't, principled people are doing their best to ensure that it can thrive. In fact, taking the long view and despite the many challenges, including poverty and inequality and notoriously weak rule of law, one could suggest that the region's democratic balance sheet has more positives than negatives, notwithstanding the very serious problems after 40 plus years of uneven democratic transition. Fifth, that strong democracy and good human rights practices by state actors invariably go hand in hand, that rule by strongmen and governments with scant regard for the principles of elections, accountability, and the balance of powers always results in abuses. It's no surprise that in any country in which democratic principles are in decline or under threat, human rights are correspondingly under threat. Nicaragua and Cuba stand out for their lack of democracy, for the limits they place on freedom of speech and assembly, and their politicized justice systems. And as Tamara also observed, quite a few countries in the region have seen worrying attacks by people in power on the role of the press and press freedoms, on the independence of the judiciary, on civil society actors. There have been worrying increases in attacks and killings of human rights defenders, environmentalists and journalists, particularly by non-state actors in Colombia and Mexico. And sixth, how does the UK, how do countries that share our values and our commitment to democracy and to human rights, and that look on the countries around Latin America as friends, respond? The answer, I think, is that we continue to do what we're doing, not only in this region, but around the world. We keep on explaining our values and why they matter. The government's integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy sets up global thematic priorities on open societies and human rights, among them media freedom, freedom from arbitrary detention, the rule of law and gender. With like-minded members of the international community, we build and use international consensus and international groupings. In the region, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and Uruguay are all countries that we have collaborated closely with on human rights at the UN. Not all of those have perfect human rights records, but they're countries with which we have collaborated closely and which often press good human rights practices messages. We keep on calling out abuses in private and in public, our armory of tools has been strengthened by our new global human rights sanctions regime, by the so-called Magnitsky sanctions. We champion people and organizations that are standing up for what's right. We fund projects to build capacity and help solve problems, and we share ideas and expertise. And a final thought, that we encourage the sorts of good economic management and efficient delivery of public services that will help encourage public confidence in and support for democratic models. Chris, I've taken my allotted time. Thank you.
It was excellent. Thank you very much. Do I just want to respond a little bit to his excellent analysis and summary?
Yes, I think a couple of things that are worth highlighting from James's comment. One is the enormous problem of impunity in Latin America, and how, you were talking about how democracy and human rights abuse, lack of democracy and human rights abuses go hand in hand. And what happens is, these abuses in many cases are never adequately investigated and prosecuted. And it's a vicious cycle, because when you have brave prosecutors, and you mentioned the case of Guatemala, and the same thing has happened in El Salvador and in Honduras, when you have people who stand up and do their jobs and try to fight impunity, when they start touching on high-level interests, then their jobs get more complicated and the support they get dwindles. So I think one very important issue is support against the fight against impunity, the support for the fight against impunity, which is something you talk to. And there's a lot in that toolbox. So it's supporting the international commissions that are being created, for example, in Honduras, to try to investigate the allegations of corruption, but also supporting these prosecutors. And one final point is, in the case of Guatemala in particular, which you mentioned, is, this corruption benefits the private sector sometimes. And there have been no sanctions against the private sector involved in these cases. So when we talk about targeted sanctions, which don't have an impact on the general public, which we obviously want to avoid, they should also target people from the private sector who have benefited from this corruption, and are key for accountability and to end impunity. And the other point I would like to highlight is, you talked about coalitions in the international consensus and the role of Latin American governments, and that is essential. And it's complicated in Latin America because almost everything is looked through an ideological lens, including sometimes foreign policy. So to the extent that we can see a coalition of governments that come from different ideologies and different backgrounds, fighting for the same cause, that is extremely effective. So, I think that's a very important point to highlight in terms of thinking of strategies moving forward that can effectively push for change in Latin America.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions already. I have my own, but I'll hold off on those. I'll call you. I'll go through the list. I'm going to have you each ask your question, but this will give you a chance to get ready to hit your unmute button or be unmuted and ask. So we have, what we have so far in this order is Gustavo Torres, Eli Catherall, Michael Stott, and Luciana Luque Pereira Leche. Why don't we go first to Gustavo Torres? Gustavo?
Okay, thank you. Well, I have two questions actually. Well, the first one was related with the alignment of the responses, because the title suggests that the UK and the EU will be aligned in terms of the responses that they plan to exert in the region. And I was wondering if those responses would also be aligned with the responses from countries like the US or Japan.
And you had a second question, or is that?
That was the first question. I don't know if...
Go ahead and ask that one, and then we'll...
Okay, well, the second one was related with the, current crisis in Ukraine and Russia, and how that may affect, the plans that you have to support the human rights in the region. Will that exacerbate the situation in Latin America? Thank you.
Thank you. James, I'm going to you first. Obviously, this is more pointed. The issue of coordination, EU, US. Again, the point about, does the US have a policy? What can the UK do to broker perhaps more, and even using some of its leverage in places like Cuba, where the US doesn't have it because of the embargo? What's your sense of this coordination, the differences between?
Thanks, Gustavo. I think there is some close alignment between countries with similar values or that share values. One example is sanctions. We take our own sanctions decisions, but if you look at the coincidence of sanctions groupings between the EU, the UK, the US, Canada, it reflects a coordinated approach and coordinated exchanges. Not least about the value of countries showing the sort of united front and shared concern that you are describing. Similarly, I think, if you take our own recent statement of concern about the ongoing judicial processes in Guatemala against these lawyers and officials who were in charge of prosecuting particularly egregious cases of corruption. Again, a number of different countries and the EU have also issued statements expressing their concern. So I think, yes, there is a definite coordination. I think there are other important vehicles too. So, for example, the Human Rights Council in Geneva gives us all a very good vehicle for expressing concern through a truly global medium. Of course, it's the most unfortunate irony that a country like or a regime like Venezuela's regime is elected to a place on the HRC. But at the same time, Michelle Bachelet's exemplary and truly worrying reports on the state of human rights in Venezuela, again, reflect the potential and the importance of an organization like the HRC and Michelle Bachelet's work.
The question also on Ukraine and Russia. Henry Kissinger once famously said, and this is an American saying this, South America is like a dagger aimed at the heart of Antarctica, reflecting obviously his neo-realpolitik view. So, how can we frame this in a way that I think conveys a real concern and issues in Latin America and also its advantages? Your thoughts, given the current Ukrainian-Russian situation?
Yeah, I mean, over the past X years, we've seen Russia working hard to grow its influence in Latin America. It's nothing new. The Russians were working hard when I was in Peru and before that in Colombia quite a while ago now. We've also seen, very significant growth in Chinese influence, Chinese investment, Chinese commerce with the region. China, of course, being a country which does not share many of our values or attach the same importance to human rights. I do think it's important, and I was in the region recently and commented to the government I met that countries around Latin America, as many as possible, put on record in a very public way their concern about what is happening in Ukraine. A number, of course, for understandable reasons, look to a country like Russia's or China's, if you're thinking about Xinjiang. Look to their importance, not least as commercial partners, and they can be slightly reticent about speaking truth to commercial power, so to speak. But as I say, I think it's really important that lots in the international community encourage countries that do share our democratic values to make very, very clear to a leader like President Putin just how concerned they are too.
Thank you. Do you want to comment, Tom?
No, I think that was more of a question for James.
Great. Let's go to Ellie. Question. Then we also have questions, by the way, including Lucas Larini, my friend, and then Antonio. So Ellie, please.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned the elections in Chile as like a positive democratic kind of thing that happened. I think a lot of people would say as well that the new constitution is a good example of that too. But as you said as well, the elections were very polarized, whereas the vote for a new constitution was actually quite overwhelmingly in favor of them. So could you talk a bit about how there's support for a new constitution from both the left and the right, even though the constitution is quite, it has like it's got quite a left with the quite inclusive.
Do you want to talk about this tomorrow first?
Sure. So a few thoughts. I think it's important to understand the background to the Constitutional Convention. In Chile, there was a massive outpour of discontent. People took to the streets in October 2019. That was met with harsh repression by Carabineros, the Chilean police. And largely in response to that discontent, the authorities generated this constitutional process. So I think, in a way, both the elections and this constitutional process is a democratic way of channeling very profound needs from the Chilean people that were the reason that people took to the streets initially. In terms of the process itself, it's ongoing. Right now, they're starting to, in commissions, approve specific texts for the new constitution. Some of them are pretty extreme and will likely not pass the filter of the vote, so we don't know what the text is going to look like at the moment. And once that happens, there is a period in which they will harmonize the different sectors that are being approved separately. And then that constitution is submitted to a vote. So it's unclear at the moment what will happen with that process. But I would highlight that it is a democratic way of resolving profound concerns that led to the demonstrations in 2019.
James, you want to?
Yes, I'm happy to comment. I was in Santiago recently. This, of course, is a region of marked economic disparities, and Chile is one of the countries in the region where the economic disparities are most marked. And as Tamara says, there was, the 2019 protests were evidence of widespread public dissatisfaction in many people's views, sort of dissatisfaction at the fact that the enormous prosperity that Chile has successfully generated over the past, decade plus, hadn't been more evenly distributed amongst people. At the same time, I talked with a number of Chileans who told me about their concerns about the constitutional process. Everybody wishes the people are taking the members of the Constitutional Assembly the best with this task, but a real concern, I think, that they need to find the ability to come together and the wisdom that's needed in drafting a document that will serve their country well and provide a good framework for not just government, but the way that all the pieces of it, the way that the democratic institutions fit together, not just for the next few years, but for many years to come.
I'll just add quickly to echo sentiments from both James and Tamara. Obviously, it's an important moment, an important gesture and moment, an opportunity for recasting the social contract in Chile, especially in the wake of the social protests and the failure of the system to really renovate itself in a way that responded to legitimate citizens' demands. I think the question and challenge here is going to be the fragmentation of the Constituent Assembly could be problematic. We see both independent members and members that are elected from different constituencies. Obviously, the filter, the requirement, 2/3 for vote to get it out into the Constitution is going to help channel that process. But by the same token, and then it will be put up for a popular referendum. By the same token, as you mentioned, Ellie, very polarized society, two extreme opposites in terms of the democratic political spectrum. One maybe more democratic than the other. And of course, so you're injecting a constitution into a very fluid, popular moment and partisan moment. And while it's positive, I think it's going to be a true sort of experiment and social and political and economic reform in the moment, and that will be, I think, challenging. Let's put it that way. I hope it's successful, but it's not going to be easy given the situation. I'm going to take 3 questions now, and then have answers, and then take 3 more questions. So we have Michael Stott, Luciana, and Lucas, and then I'll have 2 more questions, and then I have 3 more with Antonio, Nicholas, and Jean-Paul Rosario. So, Michael.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to the panelists for doing this. It's a great topic and very good to have this opportunity to discuss it. James, you mentioned correctly that, of course, Russia's presence and influence in Latin America is not new, but do you see something new in their declared aim this year and in recent declarations, the tour of the Deputy Minister, of strengthening ties with Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua? Do you think this is bluster and rhetoric designed to make Moscow look stronger, or do you think it disguises an actual policy shift that will see military assets move to the region, which we haven't seen before? And Tamara, maybe I know you have great expertise on the Venezuelan side of that. If perhaps there's something you want to add specifically in relation to Venezuela and the military with Russia.
Thank you, Mike. Luciana.
Hi, thank you for hosting this event. I want to ask, probably more targeted to Tamara, how you see the importance of recent verbal attacks by democratically elected presidents such as AMLO on media and journalists.
And then Lucas Lorini.
Hello. I think my question is mostly directed at James. I'd be interested in his take on the UK's investment in Latin America. And when I say investment, not just economic, but in terms of political capital and additional sort of development funding relative to other regions. So is not Latin America perhaps a more welcoming bet when compared to other parts of the world, such as Africa and Southeast Asia, from the point of view of UK interests? Thank you.
Great. I'll get to the other questions, but let's first have, Tamara, let's start with you on this.
I think maybe James should go first for the Russia context, and I can add a
Okay, why don't we do that? Sorry. Try to take the heat off you for a second, James. Tomorrow's a tough taskmaster.
Michael, your question on Russia. Bluster or not, I think we can safely assume that Russia is working hard. Its diplomats Russia has plenty of many very extremely capable Russian diplomats. I spent 4 years in Moscow as well. Russia is working hard to build friendships where it can build friendships. And you mentioned certain countries. I don't think those are the only ones where Russia will be looking to develop its influence, including through using economic levers where it can do so. We saw, for example, going even further south than the southern tip of South America, we saw Russia exercising its influence in Cameroon just at the end of last year. I can't comment, Michael, on your more specific question about whether Russia might want to arm or contribute to the arming of these countries. I'll leave that one. Perhaps I could take Lucas's question as well.
Yeah, please. That was directed to you.
On investment in Latin America. I agree with you. Latin America is a comparatively underfunded part of the world. Certainly, if you look, for example, at our overseas development assistance, which for a long time has been very much focused on the poorest countries in the world. But often it's countries, middle-income countries like Latin American countries, often aren't particularly in need of cash. Some are, but many aren't. What they really do need is expertise and good advice. And you often find, as I'm sure you know, Lucas, that these countries have the institutional capacity as well as the political will to make changes, but they're not quite sure how to go about them. So I think one important area of focus for us has been and should continue to be looking for opportunities to advise, to share experience to help them grow their ability to deliver the sorts of good services that in turn will bolster confidence in democratic models that we were talking about earlier on.
Thank you. Tamara, Russia and Venezuela.
Yes. So in terms of Russia and Venezuela, I don't know what Russia's intentions are, but what's clear from the Venezuelan side is that the Maduro regime has very few friends left, and one of them is Russia, and it relies on Russia And it will continue to do so long as Russia expresses some interest in Latin America. So I think it's impossible to separate Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela when you talk about, their thinking and their international positioning globally. And James, I don't know if that means that they're serious about sending arms to Venezuela, but it clearly indicates the closeness between both governments, which is evident in a lot of levels between Russia and Venezuela. And in terms of the second question about verbal attacks on media and journalists in Mexico in particular, it's an issue of extreme concern. And I think there are several levels to that. First, Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the region to be an independent journalist. Under the current government and during López Obrador's government, 29 journalists have been killed, 5 of them since the beginning of this year. So the number of killings this year has been very high. Some of them were under the protection scheme provided by the government, which clearly shows how ineffective that protective mechanism is. And the levels of impunity for these crimes are extremely serious. Another problem, you were talking about the verbal attacks and harassment. López Obrador himself has expressed enormous intolerance to the independent media and questioning of his government's practices. And you see that clearly in his mañaneras and his shows, his daily shows, in which he goes on TV. He has a section that is called Who's Who in Lies, el quién es quién de las mentiras. And he actually just showcases examples of people who lie, and he often talks about journalists. More recently, just a few days ago, he showed online the supposed salary of a well-known journalist who had actually publicly exposed some corruption allegations implicating López Obrador's son. And that is of extreme concern. You obviously can't tie López Obrador to the journalists' killings, but I think it's certain his attitude towards the press in these TV shows clearly doesn't generate a space for free expression and the independent exercise of journalism in Mexico.
Thank you. Certainly something that's also been evident in Brazil under Bolsonaro. So clearly this intolerance for a free press is not unique to any one side of the political spectrum. It's a deeper phenomenon, I think, reflecting also the discontent these leaders think they represent in the popular will, but putting at risk one of the fundamental spaces and checks on executive power, as you mentioned. Antonio, I'm going to go to you, and then Nicholas and John Paul and Patrick. And then we got a lot of questions here. But Antonio.
So I have a quick question for Tamara and one for James. By the way, this is the first question I make in person since the pandemic began in an event, so I feel it's quite historic.
You're doing well so far.
I'll stop there. Yeah. So Tamara, one topic that is often not linked to this broader political regional politics is public security. It's usually treated as a local issue or at most a national problem for national governments to handle by themselves. However, I wonder, what is your view on how the consistent failure of governments in the region to tackle high levels of criminal violence and even worse, the exacerbation of such problems by heavy-handed, policing and militarized security policies, if that has an effect, you think, on democracy and trust in government. I say this because Bolsonaro's campaign in Brazil, his electoral campaign, famously featured the symbol of a gun with a hand. So making the symbol of a gun with his hand, and that was almost a logo for his campaign back in the day, and he stopped that after the campaign. But his views on we need to kill bandits and, enter the slums and low-income areas and, heavy-handed. They are, I think, a very important component of this right-wing populism in Latin America. So my question is, if you agree that there is this linkage and what can be done, especially from international actors, and that links to my question to James, how, if you think that there is scope for the UK and other international actors to do more to support public security in Latin America. We hear a lot about human rights and anti-corruption and environment, but when it comes to security issues, the UK does a lot in terms of sub-Saharan Africa and countries that are transitioning from conflict. But when you look at levels of homicide, actually Latin America has a lot of violence, more criminal violence than Africa. So how do you navigate this field of public security in Latin America, having in mind that also you don't want to, presumably you don't want to be seen as interfering in the international sort of security policy or internal security policies of these countries?
Okay. We're running out of time. I'm going to run it a little bit, like 5 minutes or so over, because we did start late. Mostly my fault. I was trying to figure out the computer. Nicholas Watts, do you want to unmute yourself?
First of all, thank you very much for comments on Russia, because I think that's part of my first question. But I asked, where do autocrats in Latin America from the left and the right find support outside the region? Are there obvious left-wing and right-wing networks? And I would be interested there in further comment on the role, if any, of China, and also the impact of the change in government in the United States. And the second question was, is there a sense of solidarity among the countries where power is transferred peacefully? Do they work together? Are they mutually supportive, say, in regional bodies such as Mercosur? Thank you very much.
Good question. John Paul.
Good afternoon. Excellent discussion, by the way.
Thank you.
My question's directed towards all three of you, so feel free to chime in. Argentina, as you know, recently signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative with China a couple of weeks ago. And I was wondering if you foresaw or would foresee any other countries in the region, say Brazil or Peru, or even Chile, signing up to it also down the road, or rather within the near future.
Thank you. And then Patrick Flynn, and then I'm going to read one question. Catherine Pickering, I'm going to ask you a great question here, but Patrick, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great discussion. Yeah, my question is just around the developed world institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, and how they can help support low-income countries with maybe better terms, or even the possibility of grants. And then secondly, Costa Rica seems to be a bit of a success story. And is there any way to champion that sustainable growth that they've been doing through those institutions or other methods? Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to read Ryan Berg's, and then Catherine, I'll ask you to ask a question. Considering that Central and South America are in the sphere of influence of the United States and in emerging rivalries between U.S., Russia, and China, it is evident that the U.S. will have to bring order to that part of the world and reestablish its position. My question, Ryan's question, I'm channeling for him now, is there some initiative currently or planned to do that commonly with the UK and the US in terms of trying to coordinate some response in terms of shoring up, if you will, sort of pro-West sentiment in Latin America and response and policy? Catherine, you had a great question. Can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, so Latin America has quite a good track record on gender quotas for elected representatives. But among the kind of worst offenders for lowest levels of gender parity are countries like Brazil and Venezuela. So I was just wondering if you could kind of outline the role that maybe women have in tackling the decline in democracy. Thank you. Very, very good. And it's something actually that Tamar and I have been talking about in the case of Venezuela. So Tamar, you forced him, James, to go first one time. So I'm going to put you on the spot this time first. Seems only fair. Go ahead.
That makes sense. So I'll try to address some of all these questions, and if there's something missing, then we can go back to it. So in terms of public security, I think there are a million ways in which that is linked to human rights and democracy. And you mentioned some of them, but clearly it's part of the agenda of anyone working on human rights in the region. So, you know, for example, the massive protests in Peru, in Chile, in Colombia in recent years were largely due to concerns about inequality and also democratic institutions, and they were met with repression. And they were met with repression because the police forces are structurally unable to respond, you know, in public security operations, being respectful of human rights. And that is a huge debt that all these countries, there are varying levels of reform that have been put forward in each of these countries, but it's a huge debt that undermines human rights in Latin America. You mentioned the issue of militarization of public security. That is a huge problem in a country like Mexico, for example. You know, it started with Felipe Calderón, and since then the military now has enormous power in government to participate in many, many different actions. And the problem with all these different situations is that you don't have proper accountability. And it goes back to the issue of impunity. You don't have independent internal investigation mechanisms. You don't have, in the case of the military, sometimes you don't have independent civilian oversight of the actions by security forces. Or even the case of Colombia, for example, the police reports to the Ministry of Defense today. So there are a lot of like different issues. And just one thought you mentioned, I think you mentioned Brazil in particular. You know, Brazil has alarming levels of killings by police forces. In 2020, it was the largest number recorded to date. 6,400 people were killed by Brazilian police forces. And, you know, 80% of the victims were Afro-descendants. So there's clearly a discrimination racial issue to pay attention to. So I think there are like a lot of issues. This whole issue should certainly be part of a human rights agenda. And in Mexico, it is extremely clear when you look at the number of killings, of disappearances by security forces. And the other aspect I would add that you see in Mexico, for example, or in Colombia is, you know, areas in which illegal armed groups participate in abuses with acquiescence at least, and sometimes participation of security forces. For example, in the case of Colombian armed groups who are operating on the Venezuelan side of the border. So there's a whole range of human rights issues there. Briefly on US policy, you know, there clearly is a difference in the rhetoric between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in terms of human rights. During Biden, there was an obsession with Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. That's all that mattered in terms of foreign policy towards Latin America. There's a human rights and democracy friendly discourse from the current government. There doesn't seem to be a clear foreign policy towards Latin America. And it's, you know, the main issue of concern is related to migration. And migration is more of an internal issue than a foreign policy one for the United States. And I'm just looking at this list of
women's
and the role of women. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, that I think is a very important question. Clearly, you know, the grassroots movement of women has been a catalyst for change in Latin America. You know, Colombia has just decriminalized abortion, and this is part of a movement that started in Argentina with massive women's rights movement. It has evidenced itself in different ways. In Argentina, it adopted a law. Then we saw decriminalization of abortion in Ecuador, in Mexico, now in Colombia through the courts. But it's a difficult battle. If you look at, I'm going to this specific example, because if you look at what's happening, I think it's a mistake to say, you know, we are moving always in the right direction, because there are setbacks. And this massive movement has also raised alarms for those who are against these advancements for women's rights in the region. And we have seen setbacks in countries like Honduras, for example, or El Salvador. And in terms of gender parity in particular and the role of women, I think there are efforts in the case of Venezuela, for example, to generate more spaces for women to participate in discussions about transition to democracy. So there's a conscious effort to do that because it's clear that that can make a difference in the outcome. But I would say it's still very incipient, and it's a big debt that we still have in the region.
I'll just add, before turning to you, James, keying off that, and then also just one quick question. There's a great article by Erica Chenoweth in Foreign Affairs about democratic transitions led by women, in which women played a large role, and argues, looking at the history and the results, that those in which women played a larger role turn out to be more stable and democratic and enduring, if you will. On the issue of gender quotas, the problem is that at a national level, they're important, but they need to trickle down to the integration of women into the political parties themselves in local and regional elections, so that you're training a political cadre of leaders throughout the institution, so that once women arrive, they have the political connections and networks to be able to pass legislation, so that they're more than just being, the term in political science is symbolic representatives, but actually substantive representatives. So that's one of the key issues, that it's necessary, it's not sufficient. Quickly on the question of the Belt and Road Initiative in Argentina, I don't see this as alone as a cause for concern. Argentina needs infrastructure. China is walking around with infrastructure. The U.S. and the West is not offering that infrastructure. So Argentina is perfectly within its rights to look for ways and partners to do that. The question is the transparency under which that investment will occur, the sway in which that China will have on Argentina, and potentially Brazil. Brazil's already participating, and other countries will have. And then the last is bigger concern to me is the currency swap that was negotiated between Fernandez and Xi Jinping. That it indicates that China is willing to help countries get out from under the weight of international financial systems that could put them more make them more beholden, if you will, to the Chinese yuan and its financial policies. James, want to wrap up? You have a lot on your plate. Sorry, I was going to be a little more brief.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for a wide range of questions. I won't take all of them, but quickly, Antonio, UK support for public security. We do provide public security support. I think one of the keys we always look for is that we don't try to thrust it upon people. We offer it where it is wanted, and we offer it where we are persuaded that there is a real intention to do good with the sorts of skills we are offering to deliver. We always take into account, for example, where we're working with police forces, the potential risks, human rights records, for example. But in providing or sharing our experience of community policing and this conversion from the idea that the police force is there to impose the law on people to the idea that the police force are there to be integrated with and to serve the community. That needs a lot of work. It needs a lot of digesting if you've been brought up in lots of Latin police forces, but something which is really important. On the role of China, Chris, I absolutely agree. China is bringing cash and expertise and capacity and capability, which offers which are frequently unmatched by other countries, and they are offering these packages to, for example, develop infrastructure in ways that very much respond to the needs of regional governments. I think we all understand that. At the same time, there is widespread concern. I'm picking up widespread concern amongst many countries around Latin America at the risk of growing dependence on economic relationships and a strong risk to diversify. And we have seen some quite frankly concerning, certainly concerning for host government, examples of China using its economic leverage in frankly unscrupulous ways. A good example of that it got into the press, was China's essentially its offer to provide as many vaccines as the Paraguayan government might want to vaccinate its population against COVID, providing they switch their policy on Taiwan recognition. John Paul, your question about the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm not sure. And I suppose a point to note is that this Argentine government is ambitious for a closer relationship, a political relationship with the government in China in a way that is not the same in many other countries around the region. Also, perhaps worth noting that, well prior to the latest Belt and Road step taken, China had already established what's been called a deep space research station being run by the Chinese military in southern Patagonia. On economic support, the UK is a shareholder in the IDB, World Bank. We're an integral participant in the ongoing discussions with Argentina about its very significant debt and the interest that's coming due on that. So yes, we have a part to play with many others. And a couple of thoughts, Catherine, on your question about the place of women in politics. I think an interesting example of intention is the Chilean Constitutional Assembly that we were talking about earlier, which is very deliberately 50-50. There is a strict gender balance in that. It's, of course, these are tough systems for women wanting to make their way in politics to get going in. We're talking about a region, there's some reasonably honourable exceptions, but a region where traditions of caudillismo and machismo run strongly, and you have to be really very determined. That said, there are some shiny examples of women leaders around Latin America who, despite the obstacles, have managed to get into positions of real leadership and who are determined to help make change for good. That's not true of all of them, of course. One could take an example like Daniel Ortega's wife, who seems to be instrumental in this family axis of suppressing the rights of the Nicaraguans.
UK-US cooperation.
UK-US cooperation.
Maintaining sort of Western.
Yes, and Brian, your question was posed in terms of pro-US sentiment. I think I'd reframe it as our interest in being interest in Western values. And of course, the US is an extremely important partner, both in this region and around the world. And it is a country with which we share a long and firm commitment to democratic values and many other values and to human rights. So absolutely, key as a partner. And I think, looking at again, going back to earlier comments when we were talking about sanctions and statements and the value that comes comes from the UK acting with like-minded members around of the international community around the world. The US is absolutely there up with others, yes.
Thank you. Our Associate Fellow, Elena Lazarou, points out that the EU's Global Gateway Initiative on infrastructure financing has a targeted Latin American approach. So I think people are beginning to step up. And of course, you just saw the Deputy National Security Advisor tour Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador about infrastructure. So there is a response. Let's see if it's sufficient, but there is a response. Well, thank you all for joining us. And I hope next time we can see you here. We do have cookies and tea, so we'll make it worth your while. The cookies are good. I didn't have the tea. I'd like to thank the sponsors of the Latin American Initiative, BTG Pactual, Equinor, Fresnillo, and HSBC. I'd like to thank Tamara and James for coming in. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. There's obviously a lot of interest, a lot of questions I didn't get to, so hopefully we'll continue this. Tomorrow, by the way, we have an event with the health minister of Argentina and Julio Frank, who is the health minister of Mexico and is now the president of University of Miami. We'll be here talking about the COVID response in Latin America. And that is one of those positive stories. Despite some early stumbles, some of them not entirely Latin America's fault, the U.S.'s failure to get out in front of a lot of these issues You're looking at some of the highest vaccination rates in the world in Latin America and very successful stories. So, again, we're not just telling the story of the difficulties. And it reminds us, too, that through this whole discussion is democracy is not just an end. It's a means. It's a process of resolving problems. What we described are indeed problems, but they're problems that are best solved through democracy. And so, while we think about this as an evolving issue, I think it needs engagement, it needs understanding, but it's not always a negative. We don't need to see democracies as backsliding. We just need to see them as struggling to address longstanding endemic issues of inequality, gender disparity, or what have you, or lack of accountability. So it's important to keep that in mind. And indeed, there are countries that are doing quite well, Costa Rica, Uruguay, that indeed should probably be stepping up in some ways regionally to try to commit to those values that you talked about tomorrow. So I'd like to thank all of you for this. I'd like to thank Anar, who did fancy camera work. I don't know if you saw that one camera angle she had. It was very Quentin Tarantino-like. It swept down and focused on Antonio. So really you missed your calling. I'd like to thank Courtney, who's online, who keeps me in line and is online. So thank you very much. And please stay tuned.